Hello and welcome as once again we consider the upcoming scriptures for this 23rd week of the year. The readings this time, first of all, come from the book of Wisdom, chapter 9, verses 13 through 18. B, part of that is missing. From the letter of Paul to Philemon, and here we hear verses 9 through 1, verses 12 through 17. And then from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14, verses 25 through 33. Now, we will in a moment come to this and see that the section from Luke is really a continuation of the thought that we saw last time, where Jesus, you remember, had been invited to a dinner by a Pharisee on the Sabbath. He had advised his contemporary host to invite not only socially acceptable but outsiders, and he had cautioned those who were taking their seat at table to be careful where they were seated. You remember all of that from our reflection last time. This time, let us begin with the second reading, because it is the only time really where this letter of Paul to Philemon is included. Now, it is the only letter of Paul that is addressed specifically to a person. Now, I mention this because there are some letters of Paul attributed to Paul which are known as Pauline letters. That is, they were written in the spirit of Paul, but were not necessarily written by Paul. However, the letter to Philemon, we believe, was written by Paul. You will notice as we began, I did not give a chapter because there is no chapter. It is only this one very short letter of Paul to a man named Philemon, which we believe Philemon was in the city of Colossae, which was part of Asia Minor. It is one of the 7 cities that is mentioned in the book of Revelation. And we're not sure where Paul is when he writes this letter, although the general thought is that he was in Ephesus. So Ephesus would not be that far away from Colossae, and that Paul probably wrote this letter in the year 55 of the common time. He says that he's in prison. Now, we have to be careful when Paul says he's in prison. I don't mean that necessarily he's behind bars, but it does mean that he was not able to simply move about where and whenever he wanted to. Paul writes this letter to Philemon regarding a runaway slave who is known as Onesimus. Now, he has come to however, he got to where Paul is, and he's been with Paul. And while he's been with Paul, Paul has instructed him in the message of Jesus, and in fact, today we would say, had converted him to the Christian movement. So at this point, Onesimus is a fellow Christian. Now, there's a number of Onesimus is a slave. Now, what's important to notice that when a slave runs away from the master here would be Philemon, we have no way to know exactly what Philemon did, what Onesimus did, that caused him to run away from Philemon. Did he rob him? Did he do some harm to his household? Was he simply trying to get away from his master? Again, all of those reasons for his leaving are not known. In Roman world, those who harbored a runaway slave put themselves also in a very dangerous position. You are even to the point that you might become a slave yourself, or certainly would be expected to pay a severe fine for harboring a runaway slave. So Paul is certainly aware of the Roman rule here, of the Roman law, and so he says in his letter that he writes to Philemon, I'm sending Onesimus back to you. Now, later on, this will be known as Philemon's dilemma, because as Paul sends Onesimus back, and by the way, the very name Onesimus is interesting. It means useful. And Paul has said to Philemon that Onesimus has been useful to me, see? And I would like to keep him, but I can't do that, and so I'm sending him back to you, knowing that you are going to do the right thing. That's very interesting as a letter of Paul here, where in a certain way he says to Philemon, I'm doing this, and you know, you owe me. We spoke earlier on in an earlier lecture about the importance of reciprocity. So here it is a little bit at work with what Paul is saying to Philemon. Now, he's a fellow Christian. What is Philemon to do with Onesimus? If he simply welcomes him back as a fellow Christian, wow, does that mean that whatever Onesimus had done is forgiven and that Philemon should simply wave it off? If Onesimus is treated as an equal by Philemon, what does that say to the other slaves in the household of Philemon? We don't know this for sure, but we can kind of suspect that there are other slaves. Well, if Onesimus becomes a Christian and gets treated in this way, then all of a sudden we are a Christian. Could that be a possibility? Onesimus, does he retain his status as a slave, even though he is a brother Christian? Now, we have noticed this before, and probably should take a moment here to say that the whole way of slavery in the first century world was never questioned. We may have raised this before in other situations. Slavery, number one, was not the same as the issue of slavery in American life that was introduced in 1619 when African blacks were brought into this country, and the whole unfortunate institution of slavery in the Western Hemisphere and in our country came about. So that kind of slavery was not what was going on in the ancient world. In the ancient world, it is estimated that at some point in time, often 30% of all of the people in the Mediterranean world experienced the situation of slavery. Slavery could be you owed a debt. You owed someone a lot of money, or even a little bit of money, were unable to pay it. Well, what did you do? You became a slave until such point as you could work your way through and be able to repay it. So that's a point here, too, to notice. Slavery was not a forever situation. It lasted as long as it took for the debt that you owed to someone or to some group to be paid back. So this is not the kind of slavery that you see sometimes in the movies, you know, the Charlton Heston stories where he's sold into slavery and all of that. Now, that did happen. Certainly those who were guilty of crimes of serious nature could be sold into or given into perpetual slavery. But that would be more the criminal aspect of it, and not the most frequent situation of slavery. So nobody in the New Testament, and this is maybe the point that one could kind of look at, questions the institution of slavery. Jesus is never pictured in any of the four Gospels as ever questioning slavery. I think it simply was understood that it was a reality of life, and how you treated slaves, what their situation was, well, that was another story. And everyone knew, by the way, that you were a slave. It doesn't mean that they went around with shekels on their hand wherever they went. Slaves could go to market and do the buying and selling for their owner or their master, and simply be treated with a certain amount of respect and honor. So I mention all this because we would probably be, really? Jesus approved of slavery? Well, we have no indication that that situation or reality in life was really ever questioned or challenged. As I do point out, there were degrees of slavery, that is, how people were treated. But when Paul sends Onesimus to Philemon, he says, and get this, don't you love this? I'm sending him my own heart to you. So clearly, you do get the sense that Paul is suggesting to Philemon a certain way of acting, but he doesn't tell Philemon what to do, and that's why those who analyze this single letter of Paul sometimes call it Philemon's dilemma, because it would have been better if Paul had simply said, do this or don't do this. But he is wise enough and perhaps smart enough in this case to let the decision rest with Philemon. What he did, we'll never know. There is, just as an aside, a tradition which honors Onesimus as later on a bishop in the 2nd century church. Well, that's part of church history, perhaps a little bit legendary, but just as an aside, which I suppose would, what does it tell you that Philemon did? I don't know. All right, with that in mind, so I spent a little time on that because this is really the only time that this letter is included, not all of it, but at least part of it, so that you get the gist of what's happening. In the gospel, once again, continuing a thought that we saw last time, it's a story about a man who invites someone to a great banquet. Now, this theme of a great banquet is also found in Matthew. Matthew calls it a banquet where the man who invites people is a wedding banquet. In Luke, that's not the case. It's simply a great banquet to which he invites people. Remember what we mentioned last time, the list of people who are invited, how all of this works is certainly going on here. When people get the invitation, so the reason for this great banquet is not given, but it is a great banquet. And when the invitations come to certain people, you get at least 3 people who refuse. One refusal is, I purchased a field and I got to go check it out. Another says, I bought a yoke of oxen and I got to go and check them out. The third says, I've just been married, and so therefore I can't come. So those who are invited are refusing to come. Now, just as a little thought here, this is perhaps a kind of humorous little story in and itself. First of all, it follows the pattern that is very traditional in good storytelling of the 3. So 3 people are, sending their excuses as why they don't come. But look at it. Those who hear this story might have smiled a little bit. The first says, I purchased a field and I can't come. Well, he should have inspected it prior to buying it. Why does he have to go now to check this out? The second says, I bought a yoke of oxen. Well, he should have tried out the oxen before he purchased them. See? And now you come to the third. I just married. Well, he's just married. Some would say he had the rest of his life to spend with his wife. So why couldn't he come? So you see, all of these kind of explanations as to why they don't come, the storyteller might, or listener rather, might smile and say, nice try, but those aren't really excuses that hold up. And then what about the third one? The first two are dealing with purchases of a field of oxen. Do you purchase a wife? Well, there, of course, would be, again, a little bit of humor, because everyone says this isn't, if he's checking out the land, trying out the oxen. Certainly, he's not just trying out his bride, having been married. So you can see that the rule of three works nicely, because you come to the third one, and here, of course, would be a real chuckle on the part of those who heard this. I don't think you'll chuckle this Sunday weekend when you hear it, but see that the excuses are pretty lame as they would have been heard. It is true, the book of Deuteronomy says that there are exceptions that excuses that one could give for not accepting an invitation, but they all have to do with a military service, that someone who is called into the army, or what would be the army in those days, could use any one of these three, by the way, to look for not having to serve, or if one had to serve, to go back and take care of these things. But so Luke is aware of that, but that certainly is not what's at play here. But I think it's kind of humorous. Well, now what happens? The inviter to the feast says to the servant, go out now to the highways and byways and invite everyone to come, because the feast has been given and they have refused to come. Now, to the highways and byways, and all these people are invited to this feast. Again, a little bit of humor. How big is this place that they can have so many people be gathered and invited? Really, they don't have convention halls as we have today. Okay, so I suggest that there's really a little bit, or maybe a lot of humor in these kind of suggestions that are found here. Now, who comes? Well, and I pause here a little bit because there's other parts that are brought into this little section. It doesn't depend on your status in life. Remember, we mentioned earlier on that first of all, the extension to come to this great banquet would include certainly one's own family. It was therefore a question of honor and status. The people who would be invited would be primarily of the same economic, religious, educational, or social networking. But when now everyone is invited, blood ties do not become as important as they would have been ordinarily. Rather, everyone should be obedient to the invitation and come to the feast. Now, who would be included here would be not only men, And I smile again because often that would be considered who would be the socially acceptable, even from the highways and byways. But here would be also included women. And do we suppose that children would have even been invited? Now, the parable is not clear about that. It doesn't exclude them, but also it doesn't include them. Now, in verses 28 through 30 of the section that we're listening to this time, there are two little parables that really are straightforward bits of common sense, but both have the same point, namely, and don't begin an enterprise unless you know that you can finish it up and bring it to conclusion. So the first little parable is a landowner decides to build a tower to guard his house and his land. And but he starts it and then finds out that he can't complete it. Well, you wouldn't do that. Don't start a project unless you know that you can complete it. Watchtowers were important, particularly for those who had a great deal of property. A watchtower would therefore, what you might guess it was for, twofold actually. Watchtowers were often places where grain was kept once it was harvested, but more importantly was a place where you could survey to make sure that the wrong either people or animals didn't come into your vineyard or into your plantation. So that would be very important. And perhaps, again, as always, Luke is aware of those things. Herod had built a watchtower in Jerusalem with 3 towers. And he had actually named them after a friend, after his brother, and after his wife. And these towers kind of watched over what went on in Jerusalem. Well, all that may be background to this story. Don't start something if you know you can't complete it. Because why? Well, then you would put yourself in a shameful position, and you certainly would be bringing dishonor to yourself. The other little parable is that if a king notices that an army is coming against him with 20,000 and he has 10,000, the wisdom would be, don't go to battle with him, but see if you can't set terms of agreement before, because otherwise you're engaging in a losing battle. So both of those, I think, are brought in at this point because they are very, very practical, and Luke likes these kind of little practical stories. So weigh the cost of things before you engage in them, because what's at stake here is not only goods, but also power and privilege. So in this story that we hear this time, now the final little episode is, why is there someone there who is invited to the guest, who is invited as a guest and who does not wear a wedding garment? Well, there's always someone who challenges the system. Wedding garments, we've mentioned this before, were given, if you couldn't afford it, were given to a person when they came to the wedding. So his refusal to accept this is bringing, and again, the question of honor and dishonor. Dishonor to the host, dishonor to himself, shame to himself, and so for that reason he would be finding himself, he would himself be excluded from the list. Well, we come in conclusion to the book of Wisdom, which begins with a rhetorical question, and they are in parallel construction. Who can know the counsel of God? who can conceive the intentions of the Lord. So the wisdom writer, again, the book of wisdom, written perhaps about 200 years prior to Jesus' time, includes wisdom always, as we have noticed so often, is built on knowledge that comes not from the books, but knowledge which comes from experience. And so therefore, listen to the wisdom of others. In this particular tradition, the wise are generally perceived to be the older, the unwise the younger, and the young would benefit from listening to the wisdom of their elders. The supposition being that experience has taught their elders things which now, in a good way, they can pass on to the upcoming generation. This would be particularly true, by the way, of men who were looking for positions of leadership within society. So that, again, is a little background of the wisdom tradition in general, but certainly of the wisdom that's found in this particular book. Who can know the counsels of the Lord? Well, that's a very important question, is it not, that we often hear? The inability of the human mind to ever really figure out or to discern the will of God. This is somewhat, this little section, cast in the form of a prayer that is attributed back to Solomon. You will remember that Solomon is generally considered to be the wise one of the Hebrew Bible of the Old Testament, but in his own actions, Solomon often acted unwisely. But nevertheless, Solomon is pictured as praying as he sits on his throne that he might receive the wisdom of God, because he admits that he can never really know what is the mind of God. Well, who can know the mind of God? We cannot. But we can discover new things before we have an understanding of them, that we discover something, but do we truly appreciate what we have discovered and have a complete understanding of who they are, what they are, and how they play out? Well, that's all what this little section from the Book of Wisdom is saying. Quote, "The deliberations of mortals are timid, and unsure are our plans." Well, perhaps, again, there is a certain sense of humility which is to be learned here, that we can never really fully know the plan or the ways of God. So the readings this time, as I say, once again, remind all of us, and Luke, in going back to the gospel, that everyone is invited to the table, that it is not just the socially well-pleased, it is not just the rich, and as often is the case in Luke's gospel, the rich are reminded that their sisters and brothers who are not as well off are also invited to the banquet. We hope, certainly as we gather each week around the table of the Lord, that we accept the Lord's invitation, that we are willing to break down the barriers that divide us. We probably would say, no, there are no areas that divide us. Well, that might be of future thought. And certainly that we might let the wisdom of Paul, that it was given to Philemon. What are you going to do, Philemon, now that you have a brother or sister who is united to you through the gift of Jesus, through the gift of baptism? So there's the question that lies before us each time that we gather. How do we respond to the invitation? How do we treat each other as sisters and brothers united through Jesus? Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.